roundtable conferences. And after the roundtable conferences, it was decided that there is a need to introduce federal model into India. And the 1935 Act largely drew from the Canadian and Australian federal model. So the Act of 1935 itself was inspired by the Canadian and Australian federal model, and as some of you have rightly pointed it out, that Canada and Australia served as a model for Indian forms of federalism. Now, in 1935 Act, if you look at the 1935 Act, you will find that there were three different units which were mentioned in 1935 Act. One is the provinces, the second is the princely states, and the third is chief commissioners provinces. Now, the chief commissioners provinces is something that we know as union territories today. So these chief commissioner provinces were directly administered by central authority, very similar to union territories today, wherein union territories are administered by central authority. Now, what was the objective of 1935 Act was therefore to create a federal union in India, which was and this creation of federal union was obligatory for the British India part of India, right? But not for princely states. So princely states had an option to either be a part of this federal union or not be a part of this federal union. Because of the introduction of this idea of federalism under 1935 Act, we also found an introduction of the three lists, the same as the three lists that we find in Schedule 7 of the Indian Constitution 1950, and the three lists being state list, union list, and concurrent list. So there was also an introduction of the list system, which is inspired by the Canadian Constitution and the Australian Constitution, because both in Canada and Australia also, the legislative power between the federal and the constituent unit is divided by listing out the entries in the three lists, that is the legislature, the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. So what we found is that 1935 Act of India actually gave some form of structure to the form of federalism, which we see even today. Now, most of the therefore 1935 Act federal provisions became a part of Indian Constitution in 1950. But despite that, please remember that the federalism of 1935 Act was not an emancipatory or a benevolent gesture on the part of the British. It was only in order to continue their colonial rule, and only in order to accommodate different stray voices, so that the colonial rule could be perpetuated in India. And that's why you need to understand that the federal model of 1935 was not, the model in itself need not be benevolent or just. It was only introduced in 1935 to continue or perpetuate the colonial rule. And why was it so? Because along with the introduction of federalism in 1935 Act, we also found that Governor General was given the power to issue ordinance and to declare emergency, which would allow the Governor General in 1935, according to the 1935 Act, to completely do away with the federal model and centralize the entire administration. Again, something which is very comparable to Constitution of India, but in the context of colonial rules, obviously the repercussions or the consequences of Governor General exercising emergency power and ordinance power were much severe as compared to independent India. So what we find is that now you must be asking yourself why we need to understand all this history. You need to understand history so that you understand the evolution of federalism in India. Much like any other concept, the concept of federalism also in India has not been a static concept. Rather, Indian federal model has developed over a period of time, learning from our own political and historical experiences. But despite the fact that we have retained the federal structure which was given to us by the British, and most of the federal structure and the federal form of government that we are even today practicing and following was something that was already there in the 1935 Act. A lot of it has evolved over a period of time by interventions by either by the legislature or the executive or the judiciary, and that is something that we will discuss during the course of our entire syllabus. Now, the second question that generally is asked, okay, please feel free to interject or me in between in case you have any difficulty in understanding or even if you have any question. Now, the second question that we generally ask ourselves, which is generally asked, is that India is a federal model, whether there is a centralizing tendency in Indian federal model, right? So generally the idea being in federal model that there will be some kind of proportionate demarcation of jurisdiction and power between the federal and the constituent units. But Indian federal model seems to showcase a centralizing tendency or a centralizing bias. So is that some and what is the relevance of that specific centralizing bias, and why is it that there is a centralizing bias in the Indian federal model? And to understand the centralizing bias, we need to understand the context in which and the historical circumstances in which India gained independence. Okay, just give me 1 second. There are 2 questions. In my opinion, decentralization of power and division of power both are different things. We have a decentralization without federal structure. They can be different things, but decentralization is also one of the aspects of federal structure. That is something that you have to understand. Once you divide power, you automatically decentralize power. If the power is located in one entity, the power is centralized. And as someone's mic is switched on, I guess. If the power is located in one entity, the power is centralized. Now, if the power is divided among several entities, the power automatically gets decentralized. So, if you divide power, you automatically decentralize power. So, and that is what that is the idea behind federalism is. The idea behind federalism is that the power must not be reposed completely in the federal unit or the central unit or the union in the case of India. Rather, the power must be divided in federalism, the power is divided in a vertical fashion between the federal unit and the constituent unit. But that does not mean, obviously, as you said, that every instance of decentralization of power automatically amounts to it being a federal structure. That is not the case. As I told you, power can be decentralized, and the power need not just power, for example, can also be horizontally decentralized or divided. That is division between executive, legislative, and the judiciary. But that does not mean that the division of power between executive, legislature, and judiciary is federalism. It is separation of power, right? So every form of decentralization of power is not federalism, but federalism is definitely about decentralization of power. That is how you can understand it. I hope that was clear. There is another question. Every state in India has a governor that is that a colonial construct? Yes. So what you will find, so there's a lot of the aspects of constitution that we have today are borrowed from 1935 Act. So that's why, and when it comes to colonialism, there are several authors, and this is something that may have cropped up in your public international law classes, because public international law your syllabus has a specific dedicated position to third world approaches to international law, which basically is a colonial critique of international law. In the same vein, what we have done away with in the present era is that we have been able to remove the geographical boundaries of colonialism. But colonialism still exists. Colonialism may not exist geographically, but colonialism still exists. So what has just happened in this entire decolonization process, something that we call decolonization, is that colonialism has ceased to exist in a geographical fashion, which was there initially. But that does not mean that we are not still the victims of colonialism, or we are not carrying the colonial legacy. We still carry on with that colonial legacy. For example, the recent discussion that we have been having in today's politics, the contempt of court. Contempt of court is a colonial legacy that we have given to ourselves. Something that was and something that has, and especially scandalizing the court part of contempt of court, something which has been even removed, which has been considered to be not something that should be removed even in UK, but still something that we are following here. Sedition, for that example, criminal defamation, or there are several aspects of law that you will find was inserted or invoked by colonial rule in India, and even post-independence, the same colonial laws are being used to administer India. So while we may have been able to get rid of geographical colonialism, but we still retain colonial tendencies. And that is why it is argued by many that the days of geographical colonialisms are gone, but we still retain colonial tendency, and in that scenario, colonialism still exists. Okay, so
ma'am, I had a question.
Yes, Anjali.
The definition that you stated right now, like not just the definition, can we also quantify this post-colonial effect as being imperialistic, or what?
Yeah, colonialism is about imperialism, so it's more or less.
Could this also be qualified as like a neoliberal effect on our constitution?
Not neoliberal, not per se neoliberal, because neoliberal is a completely different phenomenon. And colonialism is a different concept altogether.
Like, for example, colonial defamation, something we have borrowed from our colonial rulers, but most Commonwealth nations, especially South Asian Commonwealth nations, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, others have actually, not Bangladesh, but others have actually sort of done away with it, while we still mark defamation as being a criminal.
Yeah, that is right. That is the entire argument, that how we still carry colonial tendencies within us. So, and that is why the argument that is given is that there are these colonial tendencies are perpetuated by the elites in the previous colonies against the non-elites. And this is something that is done and an example of this can be found in almost all the erstwhile colonies. So that's why, Anjali, what is argued is that while we have done away with geographical colonialism, we still retain colonial tendencies, and that's why colonialism still exists. It exists in the manner our legal systems are functioning. It exists in the manner our legal systems are administered, and it also reflects in the manner our entire culture, education, and knowledge system is perpetuated and propagated. So, and that is the colonial critique, and this is something that generally international law scholars generally invoke when they're talking about third world approach to international law. So that's why we do retain colonial tendencies. So we cannot say that the era of colonialism has gone. It is still there. It is still very much in existence, and we can find it, as you yourself quoted, in the form of various laws that we still retain and use it in the same manner as was used by our colonial rulers. So, for example, laws on sedition, laws on contempt of court, laws on criminal defamation, all of them are used in a manner to curb contrary opinions and viewpoints. So that's why because of this retention of colonial tendency, you will find that colonialism is still very much alive and thriving. Even that, Anjali, even neoliberalism, so it is sort of a deviation from what we were discussing, but just because you asked that question, it is also argued that many of the international law institutions and the manner in which market is functioning and Neoliberalism basically meaning a form of liberalism that completely favors free market capitalism. Most of these policies, international policies, which are framed, are in a manner sometimes argued to be nothing but a tool to perpetuate free market capitalism or new liberalism. Even human rights are criticized for the same manner. It is also argued that human rights are nothing but an instrument to introduce and expand neoliberalism phenomenons across the globe. So yeah, that is a completely correct critique of how we understand the entire legal and different structures that are operated. Okay, let's come back to the discussion that we were having. So we were discussing the centralizing bias. Whether in India there is a centralizing bias in the form of federalism that we practice, right? Now, as you will see that there is in fact a centralizing bias. The reason being that, and you have to understand why there is a centralizing bias in Indian context. Now, the starting point for you to understand why more power, and when I say centralizing bias, that means that more power is given to the federal unit rather than to the constituent units, meaning more power is retained by the union rather than by the state. Now, the starting point, the initiating point of discussion would be the manner in which Indian federalism was formed. Now, I told you already that we already discussed that Indian federalism was not formed in a classical federal model. Okay. Rather, Indian federalism was not formed where representatives of separate states, like in the United States, came together to frame one constitution and constitute themselves into one nation. So it was not like that the 60 of us who are there in this classroom came together willingly to constitute one nation. Okay, that was not the case. Rather, the idea was that all these different 60 members, let's say, or all the constituent units of Indian federalism were already members of a one whole family. That is said, and that is something that has been said by Francine Frankel. And the way it has been described by Francine Frankel is that the Indian federalism was as if members of a family have come in for the first time in possession of their own house and must find a way to live in it. So it was already one unit. So India was already one unit, and the only reason why federalism was introduced was in order to accommodate the wishes of different members of that unit. And that is the reason why that is how federalism was introduced in India. So it was not that provinces came together to form a federal unit. Rather, federal unit was formulated, and thereafter provinces were created in a manner to accommodate the needs and requirement and the wishes and aspiration of different provincial units, and the federal unit was created first. So that was how Indian federalism was born, unlike classical liberal model. Okay. Now you have to see what led to the centralizing bias. Now, Indian Constitution was enacted on 26 November 1949. We had already undergone partition in 1947. Now, because we had already undergone partition, what we found was that because of the partition, our experience, you must realize the psychological mindset of the Constituent Assembly framers at that specific time. There was a prospect of communal tension emerging. There was a possibility that different provinces may be divided along communal lines. And if more provincial autonomy was guaranteed, the control of the center would not be able to control those communal tendencies and communal tensions in the provinces, in the different provinces. So, though before the partition, there was a discussion was still there as to whether we must give more power to to the states, or the more power must be retained by the union. But after partition, there was a consensual view. It was sort of a consensus among all the constituent assembly members that it is only a strong central government that can sort of control and prevent the communal frenzy that was driving the country post partition. If we do not have a strong federal government or the strong central government, we will not be able to control the divisive tendencies. And therefore, India, even being before being born or just after being born, would be a fragmented state. And this apprehension continued for a very long period of time, even after gaining independence. So, in the 1950s and the 1960s, when there were linguistic movements, wherein linguistic groups wanted to organize themselves on the basis of the language that they speak, there was still this apprehension of balkanization of India, wherein India would be divided into small units, small constituent units, instead of it being one united state. And that's why what happened in the aftermath of partition, it was decided, and it was a consensus view which was taken by the Constituent Assembly, that we need to have a strong government. Otherwise, we won't be able to survive this communal tension and the communal tension and frenzy that was going on in India. Now, this is one of the main reasons why we have a strong center in our constitution, despite India being a federal structure. Okay. The second important reason being that, as I already told you, that when we were talking about 1935 Act, there were three types of unit that were already there in India: the princely states, the British provinces, and the chief commissioners provinces. Now, around 552 of the, because there were around 550, if I'm not wrong, there were 552 princely states. 552 princely states, most of them did not have a structure of governance. And many of them, which you must have read in your constitutional history, for example, we have instance of at least three states which in a manner refused to become a part of India, and different approaches were taken towards each of these three states to make them a part of India. That was province of Junagadh, Hyderabad, as well as Kashmir, and three different approaches adopted in all these three places. Now, what we find is that most of the 552 princely states, most of them were not very keen on becoming a part of Government of India, or at least were in a dilemma. Now, in such a case, if these princely states were made a part of India and were also became a part of India, but were given more power as compared to the center, it would be very difficult to retain a unified India, or ensure that India's territorial integrity remains intact. Because if provincial governments are given more power, and those princely states would also have been part of those provincial government, would have formed some of those provincial government, there could arise in very near future tendency of those princely states to sort of argue for not remaining a part of India. And that's why the only manner in which those states could become a part of India if there was a strong center. In the absence of a strong center, it would become very difficult to keep all these different constituent units integrated. So that's why we find that the experience of partition, and also the fact that many of those princely states were not very keen on becoming a part of Union of India, were one of the two driving factors which favored centralization. The third important factor was, and something that we generally seek to ignore, is the financial condition of India. Now, the only manner in which the economy of India, because British had completely drained the Indian economy, and this is something that we have read in history. Shashi Tharoor has written on it extensively and spoken on it extensively, along with several other authors. Now, what you will find is that the financial position of India was very unstable. So there was a requirement, and if you look at Indian and the and the manner in which natural resources are distributed across India, some states or some areas are very poor in how natural resources have been allocated to them, and some states are rich. Now, in order to ensure that there was the financial position of India as a whole improved, you needed to bring about development in the agricultural and the industrial sector. And for that, you could not completely rely on provinces, because there could have been a possibility where provinces may have refused to share their resources, which still happens. So that's why there are so many water dispute instances in India. Now that is why what was one another factor that sort of encouraged the tilt towards centralizing tendency in federal India was the fact that in order that India was in an unstable financial situation, and there was a lot of economic uncertainty. There was a lot of unequal distribution of natural resources, and the only manner in which all this could be overcome if there was a strong center, which is dictating the terms as to how we are going to develop at least in agricultural sector as well as industrial sector. And industrial sector. So at least these are the three. These can be the three major reasons why India has a centralizing tendency. One, the experience of partition. The second, the fact that there were several princely states and they were not initially very keen on becoming a part of Republic of India. And the third being the fact that we were in an unstable financial situation. Okay. There is a question: as India has federal nature, we also have seen asymmetry in the way Indian federalism works, and does it create a conflict in distribution of power? Yes, Atul, there is an asymmetry in the manner power is distributed. But just wait for a while. I will answer the question. We will discuss this asymmetrical distribution of power, and I would sort of defer your question for a while, if that is fine, just to keep the flow of our discussion intact. But just to answer you briefly, there is asymmetry in distribution of power in India, but how you understand asymmetry is something that you have to understand. So this asymmetry basically means that obviously union has more power than the center, but you also have to understand asymmetry in a contextual manner, that it was a historical and political experiences which led to this asymmetry in distribution of asymmetrical federalism. And does it create a conflict in distribution of? I don't understand the gist of your question, but yes, there is obviously a conflict between center and states. You will find several conflicts. Rather, you'll be discussing all those conflicts when we are discussing distribution of different kinds of power between the central and the state. An example being Article 356, imposition of precedence rule, wherein there is an asymmetry, and it does create a conflict between union government and the state government. Okay, but Atul, your question will be answered exhaustively in our coming discussion, as and when we discuss federalism. Okay, so what we have seen is that till now we have discussed what is federalism, how Indian federalism came into being, and we saw that it was introduced for the first time by the British, and subsequently it became a part. How 1935 Act of 1935 introduced this idea of federalism, and subsequently it became a part of Indian Constitution in 1950. Then we also saw that why there seems to be a centralizing bias, and as Atul rightly pointed out, asymmetry in the manner Indian federalism functions. And by asymmetry, I mean that the power between center and the state, union and the state, is not proportionately divided. More power is given to the union as compared to the state. And the reason why there is this asymmetry, or which you can in other words formulate as the centralizing bias in our federalism, is because of the three reasons that we just discussed: experience of partition, our experience with princely state, and also the financial condition of India at the time of independence. Now, because of this asymmetry of power, sometimes Indian federalism is also called, some people also argue that Indian federalism is not actually a federalism, or rather Indian federalism is uh, quasi-federal, right? So that is also something that is argued when we are arguing for what kind of uh, what kind of federalism is it that we follow in India? And what is generally said is that Indian federalism is barely a quasi-federal and not per se a federal structure. But you have to understand that just because we do not follow the classic federal model does not automatically make it a non-federal model. It is still very much a federal model. Because there is, and what are the characteristic feature of federal model? We talked about vertical demarcation of jurisdiction. That is, there will be two tiers of government, right? One will be the central government and one will be the state government. That is already there. Then more or less there will be some kind of autonomy given to both the tiers of governments, or both the form of jurisdiction. And that is also the case because there is a division of executive, legislative, and judicial power between the central and the state. So that's why you have to understand that India is a federation. It may be not a classical federal model, but it is still a federal model. Now, what is famously said about India is, and this is something that we will study when we are studying Articles 1 to 4, that Indian federal model is an indestructible union of destructible states, right? Now, the reason why we say that it is indestructible union of destructible states is because the states per se, the boundaries of the state can be altered, but the boundaries of Union of India cannot be altered because the states do not have a right to secede from the Union. That is not a right which has been given to them. And that is why we generally refer to India as indestructible union of destructible states. Okay, there are some questions that Panchayati Raj institutions also comes under the ambit of federal structure. Yeah, as long as you talk about decentralization of power, rather it's very interesting that if you look at the Constituent Assembly debate, there is a debate between Gandhian view of Indian political structure and Ambedkar view of Indian political structure. Now, if you look at it, local governments were considered to be an essential part of the federal structure. But however, what happened, the question was, local structures were not created, were not given as much power initially as they were supposed to be given, or it was contemplated. And therefore, for example, Panchayati Raj, etc., mention of Panchayati Raj, was initially found only in the directive principles. It was only in the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment that we intentionally included a chapter on Panchayati Raj. Now, there is a debate between Gandhians, and when I say Gandhians, not Gandhi per se, but who followed the ideology of Gandhi, and Ambedkar. Now, Gandhi, if you have read Gandhi, he was in favor of independent village units and the trusteeship model, that is what he calls it, wherein he was in favor of India being organized as a republic with self-sufficient and independent villages, wherein village was the constituent unit. But Ambedkar, the view of Ambedkar was because village is the main arena where discrimination and subjugation and oppression happens. Therefore, if we follow this model, what is going to happen is that village will become a site for exploitation of marginalized communities, and which would make it very difficult for the constitutional aspirations to actually be implemented at ground level. And that is why there was sort of a compromise that was made between the Gandhian viewpoint and the Ambedkar viewpoint. And the compromise was that the compromise was in the form of Article 40, which is Article 40 being a part of directive principles of state policy, an unenforceable directive principle, wherein it was expected that the Indian states would try to organize village panchayats, but that is not something that became an intrinsic or the part of an original federal idea of federalism that was in India. So while you can argue for it and say that Panchayati Raj institution also, because they are sort of vertically delineating the power, could be a part of federal structure, but the initial idea of federal structure does not include Panchayati Raj, because Panchayati Raj was considered to be considered to be an important part of constitution only after the 73rd and 74th constitutional amendment. Initially, it was not. The reason being this debate with discourse between Ambedkar and Gandhi. Okay. I hope your question was answered, Atul. If not, and if your question is something else and I have not understood, let me know. Okay, there is a question. Is it not important to create such division of power in order to deal with the cultural and geographical diversity of India and by extension the separatism, centrifugal tendencies? Yes, Vinay, that is completely true. The reason why there was a decentralization of power, and this is something that we will discuss. We don't have enough time today, but we will discuss in our next class. That definitely the reason why India was organized in a federal format was in order to accommodate the views of different areas that we are coming from, and in order to maintain that diversity, cultural, geographical, linguistic, etc., etc. Initially, it was felt that creating states on linguistic lines is going to divide India, but in our experience, what we have found is that is not truly the case. Linguistic divisions has allowed regional pride to be retained along with that linguistic cultural identity merging with a much bigger Indian identity. So it is not necessary that in order to create a state, you need to homogenize, right? And the reason why I'm saying this is because the nation-state model is based on homogenization, wherein if you look at European experience, the reason why nation-state models emerged was because of one culture, one identity. India is not a country where that nation-state model can be typically followed, because India is a country with varied identities, innumerable identities on the basis of religion, on the basis of language, on the basis of culture, on the basis of region, etc., etc. So that specific nation-state model cannot be applied. That's why there is a book by Yogendra Yadav actually where he argues that India is not a nation-state but a state-nation, which sort of challenges the nation-state model of the Eurocentric nation-state model, and which argues that our Eurocentric nation-state model is not the model that can be the aspirational model for India. So that's why Indian federal experience itself is also very different. So we cannot compare our Indian federal experiences with the experience of other countries wherein there is sort of a homogeneity, cultural homogeneity. India being a cultural, non-homogeneous and plural country, Indian federal experience also reflects that. And that is why we need to understand the context in which we are, Indian context, the context in which Indian federalism emerged and evolved. And that is why, despite the fact that it may not bear any semblance or resemblance to the classical federal model or the other models of federalism, India in itself is an indigenous model. And that's why Indian federalism is called a sui generis federal model. Sui generis meaning that a very, very innovative and an indigenous kind of a federal model, reflecting its own political and historical and cultural experiences. Okay, you may ask questions if any. And if there are no questions, we will continue in the next class. We will continue with federalism itself. What we will discuss is that and we will now pick up the text of Indian Constitution. So we have discussed federalism as a concept, as a historical concept in the context of Indian history and political experiences as well. The next what we are going to do is we are going to discuss Indian federalism by picking up the text of it, and we will only be briefly going through those provisions, because the entire syllabus is dedicated to a detailed discussion of those provisions. So what I would request you to do is try to open your constitutional law textbook and try to find what are all those provisions and parts of Indian Constitution which talk about federalism. Okay, there is a question. We can say that Panchayati Raj system had decentralization tendency. Yes. So, as the answer to the first part of your question, yes, Panchayati Raj system is about decentralization of power. The second part being, but because we do not have division of law creation, executive or judicial power between states and Panchayati Raj system, it is per se. Yes, you can argue in that manner, because eventually eventually the control over local governments, and by local governments I mean both Panchayati Raj and urban local government, is eventually vested in the state. Even if you look at the list, the list is divided between the union and the state, not union, state, and Panchayati Raj. That is it. The books that you can follow is MP Jain on constitutional law or VN Shukla. These are the two recommended textbooks that you can follow. Apart from that, obviously there are several textbooks. There is H.M. Sirvai, there is B.D. Basu, there is a book Constitution of India by Arun Thiruvendagam. If I get access to these texts, I will try and send you at least some snippets and portions of these texts. But otherwise, the text that you need to follow is MP Jain, Constitution of India, or VN Shukla. Some of your other colleagues and those who have already studied constitutional law may recommend J.N. Pandey to you, but please do not read J.N. Pandey. At least that is not something, that is my suggestion. Please don't pick up J.N. Pandey, and please don't pick up those guidebooks and bookies that are available in your campus. Please don't do that. Read good books on constitutional law, because if you don't, it is only by reading good books that you will develop an understanding of the subject. Otherwise, it will become very problematic too. Yes, Nikhil, you can refer to D.D. Basu, but D.D. Basu not the introduction to Constitution D.D. Basu, which is generally referred to by those students, those of you who are preparing for some competition. That introduction to D.D. Basu is only for competition purposes, not for the purpose of studying constitutional law. The D.D. Basu Constitution of India, which is a commentary on Constitution of India, comes in several volumes. So that you may definitely refer to. No, not Lakshmikant, Ankit. Lakshmikant is not for constitutional law. It only gives you an idea of polity of India. That is not. So please don't refer all those books that you refer for your competition, like Introduction to Constitution by D.D. Basu or Lakshmikant. You can obviously read those books. There is no harm in reading those books, but that will not help you develop an understanding of constitutional law. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So we meet on Monday now.